I've seen a lot of back and forth in the fandom since last episode of The Mandalorian Season 3 aired. There are a lot of people not so happy with it, while there are others out there that really enjoyed it. And one of the major points that keeps getting brought up in this discourse happens in the last couple minutes of the episode. If you haven't seen the episode, now is your time to pause the video and go watch the episode. Some people are not happy with the way in which Djarin gives Bo-Katan the Darksaber. And I'm not fully convinced that Djarin will never use the Darksaber again, but we'll talk more on that later in the video. In this video, we're going to be discussing if Bo-Katan is the rightful owner of the Darksaber. But before we dive further, I think it's important as a Star Wars fan for us to take a closer look and dive in at the previous Darksaber owners, along with how the Darksaber came to be and its significance, along with just the subtleties of owning the Darksaber, because it can get a little bit confusing at times and a little bit tricky. But once we have that better understanding of its significance and all those subtleties, we can take a deeper dive with a more educated perspective on Bo-Katan's current possession of the Darksaber, what it truly means, and the possible implications for the rest of the season of The Mandalorian Season 3. Ever since being introduced in 2010 in the Clone Wars episode The Mandalore Plot, the Darksaber has taken the show on being not just one of the coolest things in the Star Wars universe, but one of the most significant. On the moon of Concordia, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Satine, who is Bo-Katan's older sister and the then ruler of Mandalore, investigate a situation near the mines regarding the Death Watch. It's here where it's revealed that Governor Tarre Vizsla is actually the leader of the Death Watch, and when he confronts Kenobi, he unveils the Darksaber for the very first time on screen. And later in the Star Wars Rebels episode, Trials of the Darksaber, we learn more about the backstory of the Darksaber via Fen Ra and how it came to be. In the year 1050 BBY, which is before the Battle of Yavin, Tarre Vizsla, the first ever Mandalorian Jedi, forged the Darksaber. And the quick reason as to why he forged it, it's because he didn't like the lightweight feel of the typical lightsaber of a Jedi. As a Mandalorian kid, he grew up fighting with a Beskar, which essentially is just a Mandalorian sword comprised of Beskar. The Beskar hilt of a Beskar was combined with that of a synthetic kyber crystal, giving the saber a more familiar, heavyish grip to Vizsla, and voila! That is how the Darksaber came to be. And if you want to learn more about Tarre Vizsla, check out this video I did a while back. Now, to continue with what Fen Ra revealed to Kanan in Rebels, after Tarre Vizsla passed, members of House Vizsla went to the Jedi Temple to recover the Darksaber. And for generations, House Vizsla used it not only to unite the Mandalorians, but to strike down those who opposed them. The individual who wielded the blade held the title of Mandalore and ruled the Mandalorians. The Darksaber is a symbol of strength and leadership within the Mandalorian culture. Now, to transition a bit, let's go over a brief synopsis of all the known owners of the Darksaber, leading us to the current day with Bo-Katan possessing it. So, like we talked about before, the first owner we have is Tarre Vizsla, who wields the Darksaber. And at the time, he's not actually the leader of all the Mandalorians, but more so the Death Watch, who are trying to take over Mandalore during the Clone Wars. And when they finally succeed with the help of Maul, Vizsla turned on Maul and Savage Opress and imprisoned them. But Maul escaped and challenged Tarre Vizsla to a duel. And this is where we see Maul defeat Tarre Vizsla, and with that, the ownership gets transferred to Maul. Now, for a while, Maul has the Darksaber, and he rules his sect of the Mandalorians with it. But this is where things get a little bit tricky. When Sidious comes in, there's an epic duel between Maul, Savage, and Sidious comes on top and defeats Maul. So, by technicality, the Darksaber technically belongs to Sidious, but Sidious doesn't care at all about the Darksaber. So although Sidious defeated Maul, Maul eventually escapes his plans, and this is explored in a comic. But anyhow, Maul somehow still has possession of the Darksaber, even though he technically lost in a fight to Sidious. But what Maul ends up doing is storing the Darksaber on Dathomir for safekeeping, but he never ends up getting back to it. And who ends up finding it is Sabine, and she's the one who recovers it. And we see this in Rebels, and this is where Sabine starts her training with Kanan to wield the Darksaber. So now we get to where the first time that Bo-Katan gets possession of the Darksaber, and this is in the episode Heroes of Mandalore, which is episode 1 of season 4 of Rebels. And in this episode, basically, Bo-Katan is given the Darksaber by Sabine. And in the Book of Boba Fett, the armorer talks on this and how this is a problem because Bo-Katan didn't win this in combat. However, Sabine didn't win this in combat either. What I'm getting at here is the armorer places the blame of Mandalore destruction on Bo-Katan's false ownership over the Darksaber, being that she was gifted it. But Sabine just happened to come upon the Darksaber. She didn't win it in combat. So what I'm getting at though is what really defines possession of the Darksaber. If the person that originally had the Darksaber is no longer present or has the Darksaber or has passed, then how do you define the possession? Why would Bo-Katan have to fight Sabine for it if she didn't fight for it herself? But anyhow, what ends up happening next is during 9 ABY, during the purge of Mandalore, Moff Gideon gains control of the Darksaber somehow over Bo-Katan. And that's when we're introduced in live action in The Mandalorian with Moff Gideon holding it. And then we know where that story goes. Eventually in season 2, Din bests Moff Gideon in single combat and becomes the owner of the Darksaber. And that brings us to season 3. In this last episode, Din Djarin gives Bo-Katan the Darksaber on the premise that in episode 2, when Din was taken captive and defeated in a way by the cyborg, by the combat rule of possession, the cyborg would technically be the owner for that brief period until Bo-Katan comes and defeats the cyborg, making her the owner. But is she the rightful one? And I still see a lot of people just are not a fan of this or just don't think that should be valid. But what I'm getting at here, though, is the history of ownership of the Darksaber itself is messy in itself. And if we wanted to go with, technically who still owns it if it's a combat rule, it would have still have been Palpatine after he defeated Maul. Because Sabine just comes across it. She doesn't fight for it. And I really think we just need to have a more open mind about what really defines possession and ownership of the Darksaber. Because if we look at it from another perspective, Din Djarin has always struggled with the Darksaber since using it. It's always been extremely heavy to him. We see Bo-Katan use it and it feels much more natural. Could it be that the blade itself has a deeper connection to its user than we know? Maybe the Darksaber itself adjusts its weight and feel to feel more natural to the better suited user. And I said earlier in the video, I don't think that Din Djarin will never use the Darksaber again. And the evidence I have at this, although not great, there's a Lego set that hasn't released yet that is supposed to be based off of later episodes of the season, and it still has Din with the Darksaber. And beyond that, I think long term, the Darksaber will fall to Grogu. So maybe Din would help Grogu train with it. And there's also the other possibility that BoDin happens and Bo and Din get together, they tame the Mythosaur together, and then they can jointly use the Darksaber. But then again, there's also the scenario that Bo-Katan might lose the Darksaber yet again to Moff Gideon or someone else in this upcoming episode, as Celebrations is happening today, and there's this tweet here that we've got to look at. Really, anything's up in the air at this point. I think the conclusion we can make on this, though, is that the ownership of the Darksaber is extremely complicated, and it gets kind of messy when we look at the details of it. I think we should honestly focus less on those technicalities and subtleties of who technically owns it versus who is best suited to wield it. If Bo-Katan is going to be more prominent and a better leader, being that she walks both ways, as has this connection with the Children of the Watch and these current Mandalorians, then maybe she should have it. And after the butt kicking that Bo-Katan puts on Axe Wolves, and being that she already defeated the cyborg as well, are we seriously going to ask for Bo-Katan to fight for a third time against Din Djarin to solidify the claim on the Darksaber? It seems a bit excessive in my opinion, but I am not sure. It's anybody's game going into these last 2 episodes of the season. I'm really excited to see where it goes from here. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.